December 16, 1944. The Arden Forest was locked in ice and fog so thick it swallowed sound. Private First Class Harold Jensen, 20 years old, from Iowa, stood ankle-deep in frozen mud beside a 90mm anti-aircraft gun that was pointed not at the sky, but straight into the trees. He had been trained to track aircraft, to listen for engines, to calculate lead angles against fast-moving targets thousands of feet above him. None of that mattered now. Somewhere beyond the dark wall of pines, German infantry were moving forward, their boots wrapped in rags to muffle sound, their breath fogging in the cold. American artillery had been firing all night, high explosive shells arcing overhead and slamming into the forest, with dull thuds that shook snow loose from branches, but did little else. Trees absorbed the blasts. Shrapnel buried itself in trunks. The Germans kept coming. Jensen's battery commander had given an order that made no sense when he first heard it. Load the new shells. Set the height to 50 feet. Fire when ready. No one explained what the shells were or why they were different. They looked the same as any other round except for a small, sealed nose that replaced the familiar mechanical fuse. Jensen helped ram the first shell into the breech. The gun crew backed away. The gun barked. The shell disappeared into the fog. There was no impact sound. No distant explosion. Then, directly above the tree line, the air itself detonated. A sharp, violent crack rolled through the forest like a giant snapping a steel cable. Snow erupted upward. Branches shattered. Something screamed. Then came silence, broken only by the echo rolling back through the fog. The second shell burst a heartbeat later. Then a third. German soldiers who had survived months of artillery fire froze in place, unable to understand what was happening. There was no cover from explosions that came from the air itself. Men who had hugged the ground were suddenly exposed to steel fragments raining straight down. Entire squads were shredded without ever seeing an American soldier. Within minutes, the attack collapsed. Bodies lay scattered beneath trees, stripped bare as if by a hurricane. Jensen stared into the fog, hands shaking, knowing he had just fired a weapon that changed the rules of the war. The shell he had loaded carried a device so secret that fewer than a dozen men in the entire battery knew its real name. It was called a proximity fuse, and it was one of the most closely guarded technological secrets of the Second World War. The idea behind it was simple in theory, and nearly impossible in practice. Instead of detonating when it hit something, or after a set amount of time, the shell would explode when it sensed it was near a target. Not touching it, near it. To do that required putting a complete miniature radar system inside the nose of an artillery shell and making it survive being fired from a gun at over 20,000 times the force of gravity. Before the war, scientists said it couldn't be done. Vacuum tubes were fragile. Batteries were bulky. Radio components shattered under stress. In 1940, the United States Navy quietly decided to try anyway. German aircraft were devastating Allied ships. Traditional anti-aircraft fire required precise timing. Shells had to be set to explode at exactly the right altitude, based on estimates of speed, distance, and angle. Most bursts happened too early or too late. Analysts calculated that fewer than one in several thousand shells came close enough to damage an aircraft. The Navy's solution was radical. If a shell could sense when it was close to metal, it could explode at exactly the right moment. Engineers at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory designed a fuse that emitted a radio signal as it flew. When that signal reflected off an object and returned stronger, the fuse triggered the detonation. The entire system had to fit inside a cylinder smaller than a flashlight and survive launch acceleration. Spin at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, freezing cold at altitude, and the violent shock of impact if it failed. Early prototypes exploded in the gun barrel. Others shattered instantly. Batteries leaked. Vacuum tubes cracked. Progress was slow, expensive, and so secret that even most senior officers didn't know what was being developed. By 1942, after thousands of failed tests, the first workable versions existed. The Navy tested them against target drones. The results were staggering. Hit probability increased by a factor of 7. Planes that would have sailed through flak untouched were suddenly being torn apart by Nero misses. But there was a problem. If one shell failed to explode and landed intact in enemy territory, the secret could be lost. The decision was made to restrict use. Proximity fuses would only be used over water, where unexploded shells would sink. 4 months, sailors fired them without knowing how they worked, only that they were told never to use them over land. That changed in late 1944 when WW1 flying bombs began raining down on London. Traditional defenses struggled. The WW1 South were small, fast, and flew at low altitude. Time fuses were nearly useless. Proximity fuses were rushed into service. Anti-aircraft guns ringing the city began firing shells that detonated when they came close to the buzz bombs. The interception rate skyrocketed. What had once taken thousands of rounds now took hundreds. Londoners noticed the difference immediately. Explosions bloomed in the sky instead of on the ground. The German campaign collapsed. Only then did Allied commanders consider using the new fuses over land. The risk was enormous. If the Germans recovered one intact fuse, they might reverse engineer it. Allied intelligence assessed German electronics capability and made a judgment call. They were behind. They wouldn't be able to replicate it in time. Permission was granted, quietly, with no announcement. The first land use occurred during the Battle of the Bulge. American artillery units, desperate to stop massed infantry assaults through forested terrain, were issued the new shells with minimal explanation. Gun crews were told only that the rounds were sensitive and should be handled carefully. When fired, they burst above the ground, showering fragments downward. Forests that had protected attackers now became death traps. Trees caused shells with impact fuses to explode harmlessly against trunks. Proximity bursts turned branches into secondary shrapnel. German after-action reports described entire companies wiped out without warning. Men killed, standing, kneeling, or running, with no visible source of the explosions. Morale plummeted. Survivors believed the Americans had developed some kind of airburst bomb that could see them. In the Pacific, the effect was just as devastating. Japanese forces relied on caves, reverse slopes, and jungle cover. Traditional artillery struggled to reach them. Proximity-fused shells detonated above ridge lines and jungle canopies, sending fragments into fighting positions that had been immune to fire before. On Okinawa, Marines watched shells explode in midair above Shuri line defenses, ripping through foliage and killing defenders who never saw the guns firing at them. One Marine described it as fighting under a steel rainstorm. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers could no longer hear a shell land before it exploded. There was no warning, just sudden violence from the sky. Technically, the fuse was a masterpiece of compromise. Inside the nose, a tiny oscillator sent out a continuous radio wave. As the shell approached an object, reflected signals interfered with the outgoing wave, creating a beat frequency that increased rapidly as distance closed. When that frequency crossed a threshold, a thyratron tube triggered the detonator. Power came from a battery that was inert until launch, activated by the acceleration of firing, forcing electrolyte into contact with electrodes. The entire system had to function for only seconds, but it had to function perfectly. Manufacturing tolerances were brutal. Millions were produced, each one tested, sealed, and marked with codes that meant nothing to the men who used them. To protect the secret, the fuses were referred to only as VT, for variable time, even though time had nothing to do with how they worked. If questioned, officers were instructed to say they were simply improved time fuses. After the war, analysis showed that proximity fuses shortened the conflict significantly. Against aircraft, they increased effectiveness by up to 8 times. Against ground targets, they transformed artillery into a precision area weapon. Some historians estimate they saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by stopping attacks sooner and with fewer rounds fired. Yet almost no soldiers knew what they were. Gunners like Jensen went home knowing only that they had fired special shells once or twice and that the results had been unbelievable. The secrecy continued after the war. Technical details were classified. Engineers who worked on the project were forbidden from discussing it. When the Korean War broke out, proximity fuses were used again, now improved and more reliable, bursting above massed Chinese infantry attacks with the same horrific efficiency. Only then did the story begin to emerge. Today, proximity fuses are standard. Modern versions use solid-state electronics, microprocessors, and selectable modes. But the principle is unchanged. Sense proximity, detonate at the perfect moment. The device that fit inside a World War II artillery shell forced a fundamental change in how firepower was applied. It removed the enemy's ability to hide behind terrain, trees, or timing errors. It turned near misses into kills, and it did so quietly, so secretly, that the men who depended on it often never knew it existed at all. In frozen forests and steaming jungles, under fog and fire, ordinary soldiers loaded ordinary-looking shells that carried one of the most advanced technologies of their age. Technology that detonated not on impact, but on understanding that it was close enough to end a life. That was the real power of the proximity fuse. It didn't just explode. It decided when to explode.